Well, let us turn in our Bibles to Mark's Gospel and chapter 8. Mark's Gospel and chapter 8. When Nigel Farage was told last week that the Prime Minister's response to the latest war was roughly in line with public opinion, Mr. Farage said, quote, "I don't follow public opinion," end of quote. I'll leave you to make your own assessment as to how honest a response that was, but what I would want to know is if that is true, then why do all the political parties, Mr. Farage's included, why do they spend so much time and so much energy and so much money tracking public opinion? Politicians and political parties of all colours are obsessed with what the public think. That is why they invest so much in it. And they're not the only people to do so. How many times have you bought something online and before you confirm your payment, you're asked whether you'd be willing to participate in a short online survey? You know the sort of questions. On a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is terrible and 10 is excellent, how would you describe your purchasing experience today? And so it goes on. You get asked the same sort of questions all the time, and that is because retailers and service providers are desperate to know what you think. We live at a time when public opinion really matters, and matters to a lot of people. And from what we have read in Mark chapter 8, it appears that people have been interested in knowing the opinions of other people for quite a long time, at least 2,000 years. Do you remember the question that Jesus asked his disciples? Mark 8, verse 27. Who do the people say I am? Which leads me to my first point this morning. And this morning we're going to have a who, a why, and a what. And the who is who Jesus is. Who Jesus is. Now, throughout the first 8 chapters of his gospel, Mark has recorded a number of miracles that Jesus performed during his time on this earth. They were miracles which demonstrated the unique authority of Jesus. And if you've been with us over the last 2 Sunday mornings, you may remember what some of those were. And that is why, as we discovered last Sunday, the response of the disciples on witnessing those miracles was, chapter 4, verse 41, who is this? Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? Who is this? That is the big question that arises from the miracles throughout the first 8 chapters of Mark's Gospel. And that is why by the time we get to chapter 8, verse 27, we hear Jesus asking the disciples, who do the people say I am? That is the question that his miracles raised. Who do the people say I am? This was long before we had companies like Gallup or Murray or Ipsos. And so there probably hadn't been an official opinion poll carried out concerning Jesus with all the statistical analyses that we're used to these days. And yet people still had their opinions on Jesus. They still had their opinions. And the disciples were aware of what some of those opinions were. Because what we mustn't forget is that some of Jesus' miracles, as we discovered in chapter 2, some of Jesus' miracles were witnessed by large numbers of people, big crowds. And so, as you can imagine, following the miracles, there was almost certainly some discussion amongst the crowd as to who this might be that is doing these remarkable things. And the disciples have picked up on some of the comments made and some of the conclusions reached. They maybe didn't go around with a microphone or with a clipboard, but they have picked up on some of the comments that people have made, some of the conclusions that people have reached. And that is why they're able to answer Jesus in verse 28. Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets. People have realized that this is no ordinary person that is doing these things. And in order to come up with an answer as to who it might be, they have looked back over their history. And they have come to the conclusion that he must be one of their great religious heroes from the past. And they had quite a few to choose from. One of them, men such as Elijah, the Old Testament prophet, or perhaps even John the Baptist, a much more recent character in their history. Those are some of the opinions that people had back then concerning Jesus. That is who people said he was. But as you know from experience, it's often easier to pass on other people's verdict on something or someone than it is to give your own. And it's one thing to say what the public's opinion is. It's another thing to give your own opinion. But when it comes to the subject of Jesus, that is precisely what is required of us. We cannot go through life just saying what other people think about it. I've mentioned some politicians this morning, and if I was to ask you what you think of them, you might say, well, I know some people who say this. And you'd be very careful not to tell me what you yourself think. But when it comes to the subject of Jesus, we cannot keep hedging the question or ducking the question like that. And that is why Jesus was not content to leave these men describing what other people said about him. Instead, he comes back to them in verse 29 with this question. But what about you? Who do you say I am? That is the question I left you with 2 weeks ago. And I wonder if you've given it much thought since then. Having heard about some of the miracles Jesus did, the authority that he demonstrated in calming that storm, the authority that he demonstrated in healing the paralyzed man, the authority that he was claiming for himself when he claimed to forgive that man his sin. Having heard Jesus make those claims and having heard about Jesus doing those miracles, what conclusions have you come to about this Jesus? Who do you say he is? I ask the question again, because what we have to remember is that although many people back then witnessed the occasional miracle that Jesus did, perhaps one or two, what we have to remember is that these men, these disciples, they were present on every occasion. And so they've been following Jesus around since chapter 1, and therefore they've witnessed miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. But by the end of chapter 4, they hadn't figured out who Jesus was, as we discovered last week. That is why at the end of the chapter they're left asking the question, who on earth can this possibly be? And from what we are told in the earlier part of chapter 8, it appears that they were still not much clearer as to who he was. That is why Jesus has to say to them in verse 17, chapter 8, verse 17, do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? They have witnessed miracle after miracle, which demonstrated an authority that belongs to God and to God alone. But the penny still hasn't dropped. Still hadn't dropped. They hadn't yet come to a clear conclusion. They hadn't yet come to the correct conclusion concerning Jesus. Until, that is, we get to verse 29, where we hear Peter say, "You are the Christ. You are the Christ." The word Christ is a Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah. And so what Peter and his fellow disciples have now come to appreciate is that Jesus is the divine messianic deliverer who had been promised by God throughout Old Testament scriptures and who had now come from God. And it is in coming to that conclusion about Jesus that their eyes have been opened, so to speak, and they have seen the truth concerning Jesus' true identity. And can I say this morning that it is only when you come to that conclusion concerning Jesus, the conclusion that he is the Christ, the conclusion that he is the Son of God, the conclusion that he is the divine messianic deliverer promised by God and sent by God, the messianic king who is both human and divine. It is only when you come to that conclusion that you have arrived at the truth concerning the identity of this man. And until you do so, until you get to that conclusion, can I encourage you to keep reading these accounts, keep reading these historical records concerning his life, his teaching, his miracles, his death, and his resurrection. Keep reading them. And as you do so, keep asking yourself those questions that those men either asked themselves or were asked by Jesus. Questions such as, who is this? Who is it that could do these things? Questions such as, who do I say he is? Keep asking those questions, because there is no more important thing in this life that you could possibly think about. Do you realize that? You've got a lot to think about. You've got the bills to pay. You've got work tomorrow. You've got the doctor's appointment on Friday. You've got our mission weekend next weekend. You've got a lot of things to think about. But there's no more important thing to think about than who is this? Do you realize that of all the opinions you might have this morning, and I'm sure you've got plenty, of all the opinions you might have, it is your opinion of Jesus that has the greatest consequences for you personally. Your verdict on him has eternal consequences. And that is why you want to make sure that you arrive at the correct conclusion concerning this Jesus. That is the importance of seeing who Jesus is. Secondly, we come to our next point, and that is why Jesus came. Why Jesus came. Now, just before this conversation between Jesus and his disciples, Mark records another of the miracles that Jesus did in verses 22 to 26. And I don't know, when we read those verses, I don't know whether you noticed in our scripture reading, but there was something quite unusual about that miracle. Unlike all the other miracles that Jesus performed, this one was done over 2 stages. Did you notice that? People bring to Jesus a blind man, and they beg Jesus to touch him in order to heal him. And in response to their request, Jesus spat on the man's eyes, put his hands on him and said, "Do you see anything?" In reply, the man said, verse 24, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." I wonder if you were one of the people he had seen, would you have taken that as a compliment? You're like trees walking around. Would you like to be the beech or the sycamore or the chestnut or the oak? In other words, he could see something now, but he couldn't see everything clearly. And so we are told in verse 25 that once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes, then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything perfectly clear. And the question that this miracle raises is, why was it done over 2 stages? It's the only miracle that Jesus did that's done over 2 stages. Why was it done over 2 stages? Was this a particularly stubborn form of blindness, and therefore Jesus had to have 2 shots at it in order to cure it? Well, in view of the fact that Jesus has already healed people of all sorts of illnesses in Mark's Gospel, and in view of the fact that he even raised someone from the dead in chapter 5, I don't think that this man's condition was any more difficult for Jesus to deal with than any of the others, do you? So what was the reason for this healing taking place over 2 stages? Well, as in most of Jesus' miracles, the primary purpose of doing the miracle was not the miracle in and of itself, but rather what it shows us or what it teaches us. And in most cases, the primary purpose is to show us or teach us something about Jesus. That is what most of the miracles were done for, to reveal to us something about Jesus. But on this occasion, its purpose is to show us something about the disciples of Jesus. Although these men, they didn't need glasses or contact lenses, they were suffering from a particular form of blindness, and that was spiritual blindness. They couldn't see who Jesus is. And that is why Jesus asked them back in verses 17 and 18, "Do you still not see? Do you have eyes but fail to see?" And the reason Mark records this counter between Jesus and this blind man was to illustrate what was happening in the experience of his disciples. Prior to this occasion, they were blind to the truth about Jesus. Blind. In the next recorded conversation with Jesus, their eyes are going to be opened and they're going to see something about Jesus. I.e., they're going to see who Jesus is. But although they will now be able to see something, like the blind man after the first stage of the healing, they still won't be able to see everything clearly. They will still struggle to see and understand some things about Jesus. And what could that possibly be? Well, let's return to the conversation between Jesus and his disciples, and we'll find out. So following Peter's statement that Jesus is the Christ, we read these words in verse 31. "He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again." Jesus is speaking about himself. And please note, he doesn't say that he might just possibly have to suffer and die if things don't quite work out for him. He doesn't say that. Instead, he says that he must suffer and he must die. And the reason why he is so certain about his future suffering and death is because that is the very purpose for which he came. the very purpose for which he came. Does that surprise you this morning? We are born into this world in order to live. Is that right? It doesn't look like it this morning. We are born into this world in order to live, whereas Jesus had come into this world in order to die. If that comes as a shock to you this morning, then let me just say that you're not the first person to be shocked by that idea. There have been others before you, including Peter. Did you notice his response in verse 32? Jesus spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Do you see now the relevance of the two-stage healing of the blind man? Yes, Peter can now see something about Jesus. He can see that Jesus is the Christ. He can see something. But there is something else about Jesus that he's still blind to. He can now understand who Jesus is, but he cannot understand for the life of him why Jesus would have to suffer and die. And the reason he cannot accept that one is because he has misunderstood what kind of Messiah, what kind of deliverer Jesus had come to be. Now, the Jewish nation was under Roman occupation at this time, and that had clouded their expectations of what the Messiah was coming to do. Like many other people within Israel, Peter had assumed that the messianic deliverer whom God would provide, he would be a deliverer from political and military oppression, because their circumstances in life had led them to believe that that was their greatest need. And consequently, he was expecting a Messiah who would meet what he thought was his greatest need. And so he was expecting a Messiah who would be all-powerful, all-conquering over their enemies. The last thing he was expecting to hear of was a Messiah who would suffer and die. Peter's response is a reminder of how our current circumstances in life can so easily shape our understanding of what our greatest need is, and therefore shape our expectations concerning Jesus. For example, the oppressed people of this world, and there are many of them, the oppressed people of this world continue to think that their greatest need is for political freedom. And consequently, they're often looking for a Messiah-type figure who will liberate them. The poor people of this world think that their greatest need is greater wealth. And therefore, they are often looking for a Jesus who will make them richer. And the sick people of this world think that their greatest need is better health. And therefore they are looking for a Jesus who will make them better. And so we could go on. And one of the greatest tragedies today is that there are people throughout our world standing in pulpits like this who are preaching a message which says, come to Jesus and he will solve all those problems in your life. Come to Jesus and he will make you healthier and wealthier, and he'll provide you with whatever else you are longing for in this life. There is plenty of that being said. But the question we need to ask this morning is this. If those were the issues that Jesus came to address, then why does he insist here on the need to suffer and the need to die? How is suffering and death going to make me richer? How is suffering and death going to make me healthier? How is suffering and death going to liberate me from political oppression? If Jesus' determination to suffer and to die comes as a shock to us this morning, then perhaps like Peter, we need to stop and think for a moment, what was the reason for which Jesus came into this world? What was his purpose in leaving heaven and coming to this earth? What was the nature of his mission? What was it all about? And who better to answer that question than Jesus himself? And do you remember what he said towards the close of our first scripture reading this morning, following a discussion amongst the disciples about prominence and prestige within the kingdom of God? Jesus says this in Mark 10, verse 45. He says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Did you hear that? He came to give his life as a ransom for many. You see, in spite of the Roman occupation that Peter and his colleagues were experiencing, political deliverance was not their greatest need. Instead, their greatest need was deliverance from something else. Their greatest need was deliverance from a much more powerful tyrant than Rome. And you're thinking to yourself, who on earth could that possibly be? The Romans were pretty ruthless. Who could be a worse tyrant than Rome? It was their sin. They were slaves to the power of sin within their lives. And if never liberated from it, they would suffer the frightening consequences of their sin throughout eternity. And can I say that regardless of our circumstances this morning, regardless of our health or our wealth or our political circumstances in life, regardless of those things, we too find ourselves in the very same situation that those men found themselves in back then. As we discovered in Mark chapter 2 with the paralysed man, their greatest need back then continues to be our greatest need today, and that is deliverance from the power and the penalty and the eternal consequences of our sin. And the great news this morning is that it was to address that need, our greatest need. It was to address that need that Jesus came into this world. And the way in which he would do it was by going to the cross and laying down his life as a ransom for sinners like you and me. In his death, Jesus paid the price. He paid the penalty that was required for the freedom and liberation of sinners like you and me. And if you and I trust in him and in the ransom that he has paid, then just as Peter would eventually do, so you and I will know the deliverance from the power and the penalty and eventually the presence of sin, which Jesus came to accomplish. That is the purpose for which Jesus came and died. Thirdly, and finally, we've had a who, we've had a why. Thirdly and finally, a what. And that is what it means to follow Jesus. Now, as you read through the remainder of Mark's Gospel, you discover that the disciples, they not only had some wrong ideas concerning the nature and the work of the long-awaited Messiah, they also had some wrong ideas as to what would be involved in following this Messiah. Having assumed that he's going to be a popular and a powerful and a prestigious figure, they also assumed that power and popularity and prestige would be the lot of those who followed him. And that is why we heard them in our first scripture reading. They're clambering for the most important seats, the prominent seats, because they thought that was what following Jesus was all about. And so, having informed them as to what was involved in being the Messiah, Jesus now informs these men as to what is involved in following the Messiah. Verse 34, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Have you heard those words before? Have you ever wondered what they meant? Well, having lived for many years under Roman occupation, the audience on this occasion would probably have known men who had been sentenced to death by the Romans, and that would have been death by crucifixion. And on the day of someone's crucifixion, a small contingent of Roman soldiers would arrive in the village where the person lived, and they would bring with them a cross, or at least the top section of a cross. And on their arrival at the home of the condemned man, he himself would take up that cross and carry it to the place of execution. And so to take up one's cross, you can imagine what it meant in that society. To take up one's cross meant literally the end of one's life. Jesus is using the phrase in a figurative sense to mean the end, not necessarily of one's physical life, but the end of one's selfish, self-centered, self-existent, and self-sufficient life. Jesus was using the phrase to signify the utmost in self-denial. And, says Jesus in verse 34, that is precisely what is required of those who want to follow me. Rather than living for self, they will live for Jesus. Rather than striving to satisfy their own little selfish, self-centered agendas in life, they will live according to his great agenda. Rather than living for their own self-promotion and selfish interests, they will live for his interests and his glory. You see, following Jesus means following in his footsteps. It means treading to some extent the path that he has trod. And just as the pathway of the Messiah, and it's 4 S's so that you remember it, just as the pathway of the Messiah was one of suffering and service and submission and sacrifice, so the pathway of those who follow him will be one of suffering and service and submission and self-sacrifice. Just as Messiahship had serious and challenging implications for Jesus, so the nature of his Messiahship has serious and challenging implications for those who want to follow him. And having heard what those implications are, the question is, are you and I prepared this morning to follow this Jesus, this Christ, this messianic deliverer who has come from God? Are we prepared to follow him this morning? And while you're thinking of your response to that question, let me just draw your attention to the words that Jesus went on to say. In verse 35, Jesus says, "For whoever wants to save his life." If you say to yourself, "Oh no, David, in view of what you've just said is involved in following Jesus, I think I'll give that a miss if you don't mind." Well, listen to what Jesus goes on to say is the alternative. For whoever wants to save his life. In other words, if anyone is determined to cling on to their own little selfish, self-centered existence and are determined to remain in complete control of it at all cost, then such a person, says Jesus, will ultimately lose their life. They'll lose it. But on the other hand, says Jesus, those who are prepared to lose their life, those who are prepared to deny themselves and allow Jesus to call the shots in their life, those are the people who end up saving their life in the long term. Those are the people who end up with true and lasting life. There's those people who live life as it was meant to be lived in the present, and it is those people who will enjoy life throughout a coming eternity. You see, in deciding whether we are prepared to follow this Jesus or not, it's important that we don't just think about what we're doing this week or this month or this year. It's important that we take the long view. And I say that because what we have to remember is that this life is not all that there is. There is an eternity, and that is the point that Jesus goes on to make in verse 36 when he says, "What good is it for a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul?" So I want you to try and imagine for a minute someone who gains the whole world. Okay? I don't know what names come to mind. You're probably thinking of Elon Musk or someone like that. Well, I'm not talking about an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos. I'm talking about someone who possesses much more than they do. Someone who possesses all the money and all the property in this world. Can you picture it? But in doing so, they lose or they defeat their very self, their life, their enjoyment of life in this world, and worse still, the enjoyment of life in the world to come. And the question is, what good has it done? What good has all their wealth done for them in the long term? Yes, they've gained the whole world, but they've lost their soul for all eternity. No good whatsoever. And so that being the case, we should think twice. We should think twice about being determined to cling on at all cost to the control of all that we have and all that we are in this life, rather than allowing Jesus to be in charge of our lives. We should think twice about it because there are two serious consequences in pursuing such a course of action. The first is a loss of life as it was meant to be lived in the present, and the second is an eternity of death rather than life in the future. That is the frightening prospect that Jesus is describing in verse 38 when he says, "If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with his holy angels." Isn't that a frightening prospect? Well, rather than find ourselves in that situation in the future, it is much better and much wiser to identify with this Jesus in the present, to deny ourselves and to give our allegiance to this Jesus now. The Jesus who gave up his life for people like you and me. The Jesus who in his death was suffering the judgment that sinful people like you and me deserved. The Jesus who made that selfless sacrifice so that people like us might have life that is true and lasting and eternal. That is why he came. And that is what is at stake as we come to the conclusion as to whether we're going to follow him or not. And so that being the case, how will we respond to the challenge of Jesus? Will we deny ourselves? Deny ourselves what we think is our right to cling on to our little lives and call the shots in our life? Will we deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow him who ultimately has the right to say what we can and cannot do in life, who ultimately has the right and the authority to take sinners like us to his heaven? Will we take up our cross and follow him? Because that is what it means to follow Jesus. And so in the conversation between Jesus and his disciples, we've seen a who, a why, and a what. Who Jesus is, why Jesus came, and what it means to follow this Jesus.